Let's look a little bit deeper at the Eagles' schedule now. Johnny Mack is with us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN. John, welcome.
Hey, guys. 16-0.
16-0. No, there will be no wins-losses here. But what we will be asking is, obviously the Eagles win the Super Bowl. People have this misconception sometimes that, hey, because we're the best team, you play the toughest schedule. But it just kind of falls that that's the divisions that you play. There's only really 2 games that you get that the other teams in the division don't have. The NFC East as a whole have a very difficult schedule.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think the Eagles have a pretty easy schedule, especially for a first-place team. And part of the reason is because I don't think the NFC East is going to be very difficult for them again. So I think they're going to be able to dominate from there. And then if you look at the part that is difficult for first-place teams and the fact that you play other first-place teams or second-place teams, so those are difficult. A lot of the really tough games are going to be in Philadelphia, at least on paper. Atlanta, obviously, in the opener. Carolina's scheduled to come here. Minnesota's scheduled to come here. So the teams that look good on paper, other than the Rams and the Saints, you have them at Lincoln Financial Field. We know how the Eagles have dominated from there. So I think at least on paper it looks pretty good for a first-place team.
Well, this is where I think it's pretty difficult. They're playing at Tennessee, a playoff team, the Vikings, a playoff team, at the Giants on a Thursday night, so you got a division game on the short week, Panthers, a playoff game, at London against the Jaguars, a playoff team. You got the Cowboys, a division game at the Saints. That stretch there is very, there's 5 playoff teams in that stretch, not to mention 3 straight division games. Now, you think the division might be weak. I don't know. I think the Giants are going to be better, and I think Dallas is going to be better. Washington, I don't really, have much of a feel at this point. But either way you slice it, to play 3 straight division games is always pretty difficult there, and that leads you right into a game at L.A. against the Rams. I mean, I think that's a pretty tough stretch from literally week 4 all the way down until they get to that game. And you play the Texans, who last year probably would have been a playoff team had Watson not get hurt. I mean, I think the AFC South and the NFC, what is that? The NFC South. I think those are the two of the more deepest divisions.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you. Well, certainly the NFC South, I don't disagree. But from the standpoint of if you're a first-place team, going in, you're going to play difficult teams because you're going to play, as I said, other first-place teams. And that's how they sort of skew things and why you have all these worst-to-first scenarios in the NFL. And one of them was the Eagles last year, who went from a last-place team in the NFC East to Super Bowl champion. So there's no question from that standpoint it's going to be more difficult. Obviously, we always talk about, you have to see how things play out. You have to see who's injured when you play these particular teams. Certainly some of the teams that were in the playoffs last season will not be in the playoffs this season. That's how this league works. So I don't think the Eagles, though, you mentioned some of the take Jacksonville, for instance. Well, obviously it's a good up-and-coming team, but you get a break because that's a Jacksonville home game. And essentially it becomes a neutral field game, and we all know how Eagles fans travel. That's going to be a home game for the Eagles. So if you look at it from that standpoint, that particular game is, at least in theory, easier than it should be. So as I said, going into it knowing you're a first-place team, you're getting a first-place schedule, I think this break's pretty good. And the biggest reason all is, look, I agree with you. I think the Giants are going to be a little bit better, but they're in rebuild mode. That's clear. Dallas Cowboys, maybe they'll be a little bit better, but I think they're an average football team. I think Washington probably took a little step back. The Eagles should dominate the NFC East.
John, how about your takeaway from the fact that they don't play an NFC East game until Week 6? The fact that it's front-loaded with so many teams that are not in the division, no less, not even in the NFC in some of those matches.
Well, you know how the NFL shifted a couple of years ago. They like to put division games early and late, so you're less susceptible to sort of tank in those last few games that they're rivalry games. So I think from the Eagles' standpoint, it's good to have it backloaded for the same reason I just mentioned. I just don't think it's a very good division outside of the Eagles.
If you're just analyzing the game-to-game scenario, too, and by the way, that pattern is home, away, home, away, home, away until, what, week 14 or something like that?
Yeah, the NFL's done a really good job with the schedule this year. I think they came out, one thing they're very cognizant of is to not have long road trips. I think they had 7 total 3-game road trips across the entire league last year. This year it's only 3. A lot of it depends on things happening at venues around the country. This year the big one was an Ed Sheeran tour, which is playing a lot of stadiums around the country. And obviously if he's going to be there on a particular date in a particular stadium, you can't have a home game that date. And that forces you to go on the road. So it's some of those things that it's a little bit more difficult than people realize because of other issues the NFL has to take into account. But by and large, I think they do a pretty good job. Another thing they try to eliminate as much as possible is teams having a road game after a Monday night football game. So they put all of this into the equation, and for the most part, they do a pretty good job.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's week 12 and 13 is the first time that they have back-to-back home games. But there is a situation for the Eagles where they're home with the Redskins on Monday Night Football, and then they have to go on the road to the Cowboys in week 14 for a 4 o'clock Sunday start. Those two matchups, the the Redskins Cowboys back-to-back of Monday Night Football, short week to Dallas, or Jacksonville bye week and Dallas. Which of those, just off the surface, would you say would prove more challenging for them?
Well, I mean, from the standpoint of, I think it's good, as I mentioned, and when I kind of skew that, I think the NFC East is going to be pretty weak outside the Eagles. You always have to take into account that divisional games tend to be closer than you expect them to be because the teams know each other so well. But I honestly think there's a lot of swagger in the Eagles building these days, and rightfully so. I mean, they've been very successful. This is the Super Bowl champions. And I think they embrace the chances to dominate this division. And I think that's where it starts. And that's where it starts in every NFL city. You take care of your business in your division, and then you sort of move out from there. And I think the Eagles want to play Dallas, Washington, and the New York Giants anywhere, any place, and they think they're going to win the football game.
It's an interesting schedule, and the fact that Mike and I talked about this. No game on New Year's Eve, no game on Christmas Day night, no game on Thanksgiving for the first time in a while. Are the schedule makers doing the Eagles a favor by not putting them on those holidays?
Well, no. I mean, some of it is. Obviously, the Eagles as a Super Bowl champion, I think they have 6 nationally televised games.
There's 5 games in prime time.
Right.
They've got 1 Monday nighter and then the 2 Thursday nighters. One is the opener, which is a really high. The Thursday night opener is the really high profile, and then the rest of the Sunday night, and then they have the London game. So 6. I guess, do you count the London game as a prime time 9:30 a.m.er?
Well, nationally televised, so they will, and then there's a couple. Obviously, the Rams game, if that projects. I think that's a Sunday game, but I don't have it in front of me.
8:20.
Look, you're going to have, if you're the reigning Super Bowl champions, obviously they want you on TV as much as possible, and then as the season wears on, if things kind of derail, you have the flex scheduling that will fix that. But there's also a limit to windows any particular team can have for playing night games and things of that nature. So All of that comes into play, and the Eagles are one of the highest profile teams in this league. So, yeah, maybe they're not on Thanksgiving, but you're going to see them a lot on national television.
Hey, real quick on the Thursday, Fox has that deal, and apparently they're pretty happy. Did they make a concerted effort, or did Fox do something to make sure that those Thursday games were more attractive? Because we've been saying over the years, hey, until you start to give us better Thursday games, people are going to be critical of them. Did you think that Fox pushed them, and did they make a concerted effort to make the Thursday night schedule better?
Yeah, I think they did, and it is the be-all, end-all is television money in this league, and I think a lot of people were shocked once they saw the bid that they got for Thursday Night Football, and this is probably the reason why. Fox kind of forced the hand and said, well, if we're going to get into this and we're going to pay this for this product, we need better matchups, and that's part of it. And there's even talk for years this league said you can't have flex scheduling for Monday night games for obvious reasons. Well, it looks like they're not so obvious anymore because they're talking about that. And I think eventually down the road, if you're going to continue playing Monday Night Football, I think whether it's ESPN or somebody else gets into that business down the line, they're going to ask for the same type of thing. And I think you're even going to see flex scheduling on Monday nights.
John McMullen's with us. The Eagles' schedule's out. And, John, of course, the toughest opponent schedule based on opponent's record, the easiest schedules. The Eagles didn't fall in either of those five. It's Packers, Lions, Saints, Buccaneers, the top four with the top four toughest schedules. And then easiest was Bengals, Raiders, Titans, Texans. Texans having the easiest schedule. Where did the Eagles fall in that scale of teams?
Well, let me say this. Pet peeve, strength of schedule is absurd statistic. It's ridiculous. And I got into it with a few people on Twitter for obvious reasons. Obviously, you have a 32-team league.
Wait, what's the Twitter handle at the PT973 that you were going to do it with?
Yeah. No, but obviously you have a 32-team league, and there's only 16 games. So obviously people don't play everybody else. So it's not a static thing. So when you look at records from last season and try to project schedules this season, and we just talked about at the beginning of this conversation, the Eagles were worst to first. Well, if you looked at the Eagles' schedule last year and you said it's going to be really difficult because you're facing 13-3 Dallas twice, didn't turn out that way. And it never turns out that way for the reason the way it's weighted and the way the league does it. And the fact that you're a first-place team, you play a first-place schedule. From that standpoint, it's going to look more difficult than it's going to be just from the nature of where it is. And obviously, if you're playing an 0-16 Cleveland Browns team, well, twice, hey, guess what? That's 0-32. That schedule looks pretty good, but they're headed in the right direction. So of all the things, maybe of the schedule being released, my biggest pet peeve is that's a win, that's a loss game. But my second is the strength of schedule stories because they are beyond meaningless.
John McMullen at JF McMullen joining us here on the Sports Bash. I do want to touch on real quick your piece that you can read right now at 973ESPN.com. You write that the Eagles face a challenge in rookie free agency. It's an area that they hit a pretty big home run last year with a guy like Corey Clement. So what's the challenge for Philadelphia in that area?
Yeah, Joe Douglas mentioned, I think a lot of people sort of default to the assumption that players will want to play for the Super Bowl champions. In the case that's generally true for veteran players looking to get a championship. But when you're a young player who's not been drafted, what you're looking for is a roster that will give you an opportunity. And by definition, if you win the Super Bowl, that means you're pretty good, you're pretty talented, you're pretty deep. So Joe flat out admitted that makes it more difficult in undrafted free agency because agents around this league are smart and they're looking at depth charts, and they're culling them and looking at every player, and they're going to steer their clients to the best possible situation for them to make a football team. And that's probably not going to be Philadelphia. So the Eagles have a lot of work to do in what shapes up as a very important year for undrafted free agency, because they don't have, at least right now, a second or third round pick. So it's going to be more important to find the Corey Clements of the world, but it's going to be more difficult to convince him to come here.
So, John, what's the record?
16-0.
Sports Bash Live. By the way, they will.
You what,
yeah.
I will say real quick, record inside the division, 6-0.
Ooh, you're that down on the NFC East.
I really am.
All right. So 5 primetime games, a London game, 8 1 o'clocks, 2 4:25, a couple of reunions. You'll get Frank Reich here in Philadelphia with his Colts. You'll also see Vinnie Curry and Bo Allen with the Tampa Bay Bucks. You'll get to see Patrick Robinson and the Saints down there. You also got a couple of playoff rematches opening up against Atlanta and Minnesota. You got a bunch of playoff teams that will be on this list, like Tennessee, Minnesota, Carolina, Jacksonville, New Orleans, among others. So a look at the schedule with John McMullen here on 97.3 ESPN. John, have a great weekend, my friend. We'll be getting into the draft heavy next week.
All right. Thanks, guys. Enjoy it.
He appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.